Hello, my name is Maria Young. I'm a Mi'kmaq woman studying forensic psychology at St. FX, and I'm currently finishing my first year here. You're currently listening to my single-episode podcast entitled Decolonization and Native Feminism. This podcast is an assignment submission for my Introduction to Women in Gender Studies class taught by Dr. Morgan Bim at St. Francis Xavier University. This podcast's central message dives into the question, what is the most effective way to make change in relation to decolonization? Today, I'll be specifically speaking about the settler colonization of Turtle Island. In case you don't know, Turtle Island is a term that many indigenous people use to refer to the continent of North America. So, the podcast Rethinking Development has an episode co-hosted by Safa S. and Noman Ali called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. In that episode, they have a great conversation about decolonization and exactly what that means. I'm bringing it up because during that podcast, Noman says, and I quote, "Anybody who wants to talk about decolonization, you can't talk about it without first talking about colonization." That quote just made a lot of sense to me and really fit in with what I'm trying to do on this podcast. So that's exactly what I want to do next, is talk about colonization. According to the Canadian Encyclopedia, colonization began throughout Canada in the early 15th century. Almost immediately, the Indigenous people of Canada felt its effects. Our land, resources, and traditions started to be taken away from us. An important aspect of colonization that I want to make clear is that it is ongoing. It may have begun centuries ago, but it's not a thing of the past. Indigenous people, and all people of Canada for that matter, still face the ongoing effects of colonization. Canada has been built on the blood and displacement of Indigenous people, yet so many people still don't know its true history. Unfortunately, Canada does an excellent job of sweeping things under the rug. Almost everything we know about the colonization of Canada was written from a colonizer's perspective, a colonizer's point of view. So a part of decolonization is decolonizing the narrative. Even the word colonization itself obscures people's understanding of how Canada came to be. The word colonization is constantly used to basically summarize hundreds of years' worth of attempts at genocide. Within this context, Lawrence, 2002, states that colonization, and I quote, obscures the processes that enabled colonizers to acquire the land and the policies that were put into place to control the peoples displaced from the land. Lawrence, 2002, also writes, as history is currently written from outside indigenous perspectives, we cannot see colonization as colonization. We cannot grasp the overall picture of a focused, concerted process of invasion and land theft. Page 26. I know some Indigenous activists who, because of this, prefer using terms like indigenizing or anti-colonialism. Personally, I like anti-colonialism as an alternative to decolonization because it moves away from the framing that colonization is finished. Decolonization sounds like an attempt to undo something already done, whereas to be anti-anything sounds more like actively resisting something ongoing. So, it is difficult and incorrect to talk about colonization as a singular event that has already occurred. Instead, the process of colonization happened as a series of events and attacks against Indigenous people that are still ongoing, even if they look different than they did a couple of centuries ago. Sherry Pictou, an Indigenous feminist and scholar, talks about the importance of going beyond surface-level decolonization. In her paper, Decolonizing Decolonization, an Indigenous Feminist Perspective on the Recognition and Rights Framework, 2020, she speaks about how decolonization is conceptualized in the new rights framework from an Indigenous feminist perspective. She attempts to address the deeper power imbalances rooted in colonial legacies. Decolonization is an important concept in feminist studies, because many of the issues feminist activists and scholars are working to address exist because of colonization. Colonization affects everyone, but the instillment of the patriarchy and cis-heteronormative ideas surrounding gender roles and sexuality have had a particularly harmful effect on women and queer people. Colonization as a whole is an intersectional struggle, and it affects intersectional identities such as Indigenous women and queer Indigenous folks uniquely. Michael Paramo, in Transphobia is a White Supremacist Legacy of Colonialism, 2018, speaks about how gender itself, as a social construct, is a colonial concept, as well as the idea that there are acceptable and unacceptable ways to be any particular gender. Harmful gender roles and stereotypes exist because of settler colonialism. What we consider today to be two-spirit and queer identities have always existed in Indigenous communities, but through the process of colonization, sex and gender have been conflated, and we've lost many of our practices and traditions. Paramo 2018 states, and I quote, "The normalization of the gender binary in our current age has resulted in widespread disdain and violence being directed at trans people for merely existing." Page 4. According to Tuck 2013, we should strive for a decolonized approach to feminism. This approach should focus on the perspectives of Indigenous women and queer people, mainly because within feminist movements, these groups of people have a history of being overlooked and talked over. We must take a more intersectional and decolonized approach towards feminist activism. In her paper, she theorizes 5 challenges we must overcome in order to do this. The first being to problematize and theorize the intersections of settler colonialism, heteropatriarchy, and heteropaternalism. The second challenge is to refuse the erasure of Indigenous women within gender and women in studies, as well as make the study more inclusive. The third is to form alliances in which, and I quote, "differences are respected and issues of land and tribal belongings are not erased in order to create solidarity, but rather relationships to settler colonialism are acknowledged as issues that are critical to social justice and political work that must be addressed." Page 19. The fourth challenge is to recognize Indigenous ways of knowing and implement Native feminist theories. Tuck suggests that Indigenous issues related to land, sovereignty, and decolonization would be effective starting points. The fifth and final challenge is to question academic participation in Indigenous dispossession. According to Tuck 2013, we need to, and I quote, "question how the discursive and material practices of gender and women studies and the academic at large may participate in the dispossession of Indigenous people's lands, livelihoods, and futures, and to then divert from these practices." Page 25. I think making a greater effort in implementing Native feminist theories into mainstream feminist studies is really crucial work, and something everybody can benefit from. Indigenous women have always been doing this type of work. For example, the Native Women's Association of Canada had a newsletter that, throughout the 1980s, contained updates on issues and legislation relating to Indigenous women. They wrote about things such as sex discrimination within the Indian Act, which is an issue people still have been fighting against even in recent years. Aside from issues relating to policy, violence against Indigenous women is also a centuries-old issue that we are still fighting for an end to. The feminist magazine Woman's Spirit came out with an article in 1987 that was published by the Native Women's Resource Centre of Toronto. It was in regard to the report Battered but Not Beaten, Preventing Wife Battering in Canada, published by the Canadian Advisory Council on the Status of Women. Even though Indigenous women have been speaking out against these issues for decades, violence against Indigenous women and girls has only been acknowledged as a serious issue by the Canadian government very recently. According to LaRocque, 1994, while all Aboriginal people are subjected to racism, women further suffer from sexism. Racism breeds hatred of Aboriginal peoples. Sexism breeds hatred of women. For Aboriginal women, racism and sexism constitute a package experience. Page 73. Violence directed to our Indigenous women is not only an attack on them, but on our culture as a whole. Women are very important in most Indigenous cultures and are considered sacred. For example, the menstrual cycle is considered a form of ceremony within Mi'kmaq culture. But colonial concepts of women have normalized viewing this natural aspect of our bodies as dirty and gross. Indigenous feminists have worked to undo these harmful patriarchal ideas and highlight the important roles women play in our culture. For example, the 1994 documentary Hands of History, directed by Loretta Todd, showcases the role Indigenous women play in nurturing Indigenous cultures and communities. The number of missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada is disproportionately high and most likely higher than reported. According to the Native Women's Association of Canada, Indigenous women and girls account for around 10% of all female homicide victims, despite only being roughly 3% of the population. Overall, the decolonization and indigenization of feminist activism and history is extremely necessary. Colonialism is alive and well in Canada, and there's no singular solution for that problem. But the best way we can decolonize is to protect Indigenous women and girls and two-spirited people, educate others as well as yourself, and let the voices of Indigenous women and queer folks be heard. Thank you for listening.